Good morning. We are continuing our review of the conclusion of Ayin Beis in volume 3. We are on page 1438. Aleph Tov Lamed Ches. In sum, we are discussing the Yichud, which of course is the central theme of Ayin Beis, the unification, the integration between godliness and existence, all captured in the words Hashem Echad, that even in the Ches and Daled of time and space of existence, we are mamshich the Achdus of the Aleph, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And the process, when we do that, the proper contemplation, the proper concentration and devotion, that in turn impacts the animal soul, that v'haftas Hashem Elokecha, not just the divine soul loves God, but also b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, with both sides of the heart. As we've been learning, here he's not emphasizing right now the nefesh habamis, but we have talked about that and we will discuss it. I'm just putting it into context. Here he's discussing the 248 words, tevis, ramach tevis of Krishma, which are also correspond to the 248 positive mitzvahs, which in turn unite existence with the ramach evor in the malka, the 248, we call it cosmic limbs of the divine, that essentially allow for God to express himself. So just like we have limbs and organs, so al derech mashal, as a metaphor, we're creating the divine image, God's kalim, so to speak. There's the eris and the kalim, the faculties and their containers. They are the evar and the malka, and that exactly is a mitzvah. Every mitzvah corresponds to another ever. So we're middle of the discussion of this achdus, which he calls yichud Kudsha Bricha v'Shechina. The yichud of Kudsha Bricha, which he refers to Kudsha, the word kodesh. Kodesh is kadosh umuvdal, it's removed. And Shechina is shechenes u'mislabeshes. It manifests and gets enclosed and immersed into existence. So that's the two levels of the divine. Sevav Kalaman and Mamala Kalaman, as he stated that explicitly back when he started this discussion, basically in the bottom of page 1435, 1436. Now we're on 1438. I've been trying to do this in a more concise way instead of reading every detailed line, but more giving the general summary. In some places we are reading almost everything, so that's been the approach here. And he explained that Yichud Kudsha Bricha v'Shechina exists adreim hamaylas, all the way to the highest levels, because this Yichud has to be accomplished not just in Yetzirah, not just Nasiya, Yetzirah, and Bria, but in Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. So briefly, we've learned how it's Zoh and Malchus. We've learned how it's Bina and Zoh, how it's Chachma and Bina, and how it's Keser or Arich and Chachma. Now we're discussing how in Arich Anpin itself, in Keser, which is higher than Atzilus, in the psychological language, the superconscious levels, there's also Kudsha Bricha v'Shechina. And briefly, that's going to be just like in Atzilus, it's Zoh and Malchus, Zoh being the Midos that are really removed, and Malchus is relating more to existence. So Zoh is Kudsha Bricha, and Malchus is Shechina. The same thing in Keser, there's also Midos and Malchus. Malchus draws down Keser into Atzilus, like we said, is the nefesh of Atzilus, but there's also a ruach and a neshama of Arich, and the ruach is the Midos. And that's what middle of learning about the Midos of Arich. So this is essentially, think of the Midos just like the superconscious intelligence. There's also superconscious Midos that are rooted in Ratzon Elyon. So even though, as he explained, Midos are the intelligence and consciousness gives birth to Midos, but he made it clear that it gives birth to it means it activates it. But the Midos are rooted higher than Seichel, and the proof is because the Midos can be more intense even than the Seichel that compels those feelings. To the point that even when the Seichel disappears or you forget, what inspired you so much, the midas can stay there with full intensity, as he explained. So you have to say that the midas are rooted in a place that's even higher than chachma and being a bit higher than the moichin, than conscious intelligence, and that is in the superconscious, as he called it. He called it in the Ratzon that the Ratzon just gamken In Ratzon is Midos HaAtzmiim, which in Spheris is the Midos Keser, or the Midos Arich. And that, as we're going to learn shortly, is the Kudsha Brich relative to the Malchus of Arich, which becomes the Nefesh, the energizing force of time and space, of Elam Shana, of Atzilus, as we learned. So I'm ready to continue. As I said, the focus here is not so much to understand these midas before Atzilus, even though it's part of the discussion. Because listen, whenever you contemplate on unity, you want to connect even not only our seichel, but also our midas to the highest levels. If we can align our emotions to the emotions that are embedded within the Ratzon, within the very wiring of our souls, obviously that's also part of the yichud. And that's the goal, to be miyachid, Kudsha Brich Shechina also in Keser. So that's the general reason he's explaining it. But let's continue on page 1438. We're up to around 6 lines from the top. We finished 5 lines from the top. We talked about the midas that are there in Ratzon, and that's why they're so intense. What generates them? Because they can remain dormant. People have a ava v'yira, let's say, a love and reverence of God, that can remain concealed or asleep within you. The hisbonenus, like we discussed, when you contemplate on the greatness of God, on how God sustains you, gives you life, gives you blessings, that awakens the midas that are there already, but they're in a state of, like I said, in a dormant state. So it comes through seichel v'tam. Now, he continues on line 6, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Again, I'm going to go pretty quickly here, because I don't want to get distracted, even though these are all fascinating topics. And since we learned it the first time around, it's all recorded in detail. And I learned it and I taught it in a very detailed way. So I'm relying that if anyone really wants to go deeper into it, you could check it out there. And it's all available. You just go to chassidussupply.com or ayinbeis.com, and you could just find these earlier chapters, or earlier classes rather, on these pages. Okay, so now he says, Ratzon, and Ratzon, remember, is Keser. In Spheris, Ratzon is Keser. So even though he said it's higher than reason, so this Chachma, Bina, and Das, that's Seichel in Atzilus, or what we call conscious intelligence, there, it's a revealed reason. When you say in Arich or in Keser, in Ratzon, you think he just wants it. That's what God wants. It has nothing to do with Seichel. He says, no. It's known there's also a Seichel there. However, it's a concealed Seichel. Like we learned earlier, when God says, for example, Shteik kach b'machshava. Now we don't know God's mysterious plans. And he said that to the angels who were crying out in protest, how could Zutayr v'Zuschara, when they saw Rabbi Akiva and the other great martyrs being brutally murdered, as we say, Eila Eskara and Yom Kippur, the 10 martyrs, and they said, is this Torah and this is reward? And God says, Shtei kachol machshava. That's what arose in thought. So Chassidus explains that's not just God being obstinate and saying, be quiet and there's no reason. There's a reason, but it's hidden. It's my reason. It's one beyond us, like less machshava tfisa beklal. Does not mean that God does not have a reason. But it's not a reason that is in our, that we can fathom. However you explain it. The bottom line is, there's a tam komus. V'imkein hamidas sheberotzen hem gam ken al pi tam komus shebehem. So then, in an interesting way, it's taka rooted higher than conscious intelligence, but the midas in Keser, in Ratzon, are al pi tam according to the hidden reason. So in other words, when we say, for instance, that in our nefesh, he said mushreshes, it was the word hashrosha tivis. Just like a person may have natural musical talent. Some, people have a natural chesed that they're born with in their genes, in their DNA, Whether it's revealed or not and activated is another story, but it's there. So you'd think, okay, some people are blessed with that and some are not. He says, no, there's also a hidden, deeper reason behind that as well. It's just not a conscious one. It's a super conscious one. And that explains, if you're saying that the Midas are not rooted in intelligence, intelligence just activates them, so why do we need to have intelligence? Why can't we find another way to access those innate or inert or in inherent Midas? So he says, no, because the Midas do have a connection to a superconscious intelligence, and that's why the process to get them activated is because there was a tam komas v'nelam. That's why these Midas shabarat mislapshem b'seichel is b'chinas tam l'rotz. So now you have a reason. You contemplate, like I mentioned from the Rambam, God's greatness. You contemplate on God's greatness, and there's a reason, a logical and rational reason that God is good to you. He's giving you life. He's the reality of all of existence. Or the same, you contemplate on the qualities of a person, and you come to discover Avos Yisrael because you appreciate this person's soul through the contemplation. So on one hand, the contemplation didn't create the midah. On the other hand, it's the one that activated it. And furthermore, it's connected because the midas are rooted in a superconscious place. So therefore, it makes sense that there'll also be a reason, a conscious reason. That's how he's explaining it. But again, I don't want to digress. I just don't want to leave this hanging. So this is what he says. So bottom line is there are midas in Ratzon and Keser. So if that's the case, then he goes back to the question he asked before. So why does the midah remain even when the reason is concealed? Meaning you forget the reason, or the reason is has faded away. However you explain that. The eid b'teik of harbi. And we said not only that, it's also with more intensity even than the compelling reason that led you to that midah. In other words, let's say a person fall in love, they date their potential spouse, then they fall in love with this person. But the falling in love took time. It came because your mind kept seeing the qualities of the person, and it aroused in you feelings, and now the feelings are a lot stronger than the reasoning that you had behind it. So even whether you're aware of the reason or not, the midas are now the most intense aspect. So here's how he explains it. So if you said it's rooted in the Midas HaRatzon higher than Seichel altogether, you could say, okay, that's why it's more intense, because it has that. But you're saying it also relates to the superconscious reasoning. So why is the Midas stronger than the reasoning? So he says, the Midas HaRatzon yesh beis madreges. That in the Midas, in the superconscious state, in desire of the Nefesh, there's two levels. Midas that come based on a concealed reason that you may not even be aware of, but there is a reason somewhere in the deeper recesses of your psyche. The Etzem HaMidas, and then there's the Etzem Midas, the Hainu HaRatzon she'enim apitam klal. And then there's a level of Midas that don't have any reason at all. It's just who you are. That's the nature of the person. There's no particular reason for it. Like we say the expression that there's something, that's what the person wants. It doesn't have to have a reason. So he's now explaining there's two levels in this. Why is this relevant? We'll see in a moment. So he says, so too, these two levels you can say are also in Keser. Remember, Keser is the Kabbalistic term for the level of Ratzon. Like we learned, the whole Ayin Beis begins with Keser, and is a big central piece of the interface, Keser. So he says, Keser is the Ratzon Elyon, the supernal will, God's will, higher than Chachma, which comes after Keser. In Keser, we know, as we've learned, there's a level called superconscious intelligence, called concealed Chachma. That's like the first level. There's a tam komis. However, it's a superconscious reason, not one that we can easily explain. But there's something there on that level. Shamidas shebekeser boim gamkein b'bchinas medida al pi b'chinas hachachma shebekeser. So the midas of keser, remember midas come also from the word midah, as in measurement. There's as parameters. So even though we're talking on a higher level than the midas of Atzilus, we're not talking about conscious feelings, we're talking super conscious feelings. But they too come according to the measure of which measure? The chachma, the chachma shebekeser, meaning that hidden wisdom, that hidden intelligence. A simple example would be, you see somebody who doesn't seem to deserve reward, and you see God rewards that person. Or the opposite, someone who seems to deserve reward and the person gets hurt. So we don't understand it. We use our logic, it makes no sense. But then you come to discover, sometimes you come to discover, sometimes you don't, but you come to discover, 1 second here. Time passes and you realize that which looked like a blessing for one was actually not such a blessing. And that which looked like an opposite of a blessing was not such an opposite of a blessing. And we say, Gam Zula Teva. You watch the narrative continue, you see actually this turned into a blessing. So it was a tam komus. However, we didn't understand it at the time. That's the first level, where there is a tam, but it's a hidden reason. But here, being that we're talking in Keser, in a more superconscious state, this medida is not quite defined or you could say limited as it is in the Midas and Atzilus itself. Fine. And these Midas then come to Chachma and Atzilus, where there now you have a rational reason that you could explain, which in turn will awaken the actual conscious feeling. So essentially you have your 4 steps. You have a hidden reason that is superconscious, that is the cause of these midas that are also superconscious, that in turn, when you contemplate with your conscious intelligence, you are reaching into the superconscious intelligence, which in turn gives birth and generates the midas that are conscious midas of actual love or gvura or reverence or whatever the midah may be. That's the first level. But there's a higher level, he said, that's completely beyond reason. Ratzon b'lei tam. B'chinas Etzem HaRatzon and b'chinas Midos HaAtzmiim. To b'chinas HaKeser. Now we're talking about the Etzem HaRatzon, which is even higher than everything. Like if you ask the question, why does God want the mitzvah of paraduma or shatnez, the chukim? We're not talking about the rational mitzvahs. The rational mitzvahs, you could say, even they always have some deeper reasoning and even beyond. But there you can explain, to have a civilized world, you need to have tzedakah, charity. You need a certain bein adam l'chavere, certain civilized laws that create a civil behavior between each other. But there are mitzvahs you could say, shatnez, is there a reason behind it? So yes, we could find an explanation, but at the root of it, it's Etzem HaRatzon. That's what God wanted. It comes from a place that's higher than reason, because reason wasn't created yet. So Midos HaAtzmiim. These are the Midos HaKeser who she'enam al pi Midos HaChachma klal. This is just like the king says, I'd like you to do something for me. So if you're giving a reason, there's some type of giluyim, some type of benefit. The king is giving you a reason, do this because it'll benefit me, it'll benefit you, it'll benefit others. But sometimes there's Gzeres HaMelech, like we say, Chukah Chakakti, Gzeres Gezarti. God just commanded, that's what he wants. In Likutei Torah, there's an expression that he wants us doing a mitzvah simply because of Kabbalah said, because God said so, even if he told us to go chop wood, which he doesn't tell us, not a mitzvah to chop wood. But the point being, not relevant here, that there's a benefit. This is what God wants. This is the Ratzon Elyon. So he says, this is higher than Chachma. So what he's coming to help us understand here is a divine transcendent level that when you make the Yichud, Kudsha, Brich, Shechina, you want to connect to God, like I always point out, God on God's terms. When God is speaking to us, Al Pitam V'das, which is an Aveda that makes sense, then God is speaking to us on our terms. But if you want experience of God in his purest form, this is that type of experience. On the parentheses, let's hear. It's not a short parentheses. I want to see if I want to go over it. It's a little dense. Okay, briefly, he's going to say the Efshi Yeshlemer, that these two levels in the Midos of Keser, which only help us understand yet another level of interface, is similar to what we learned in Atzilus. Remember, he's comparing the Midos of Atzilus, the Midos of Keser to Midos of Atzilus. So in Atzilus, we learned that the 10 spheres have two functions. One is for Atzilus itself. The 10 spheres of Atzilus, they express divine Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Chachma, Bin, etc. Then there's the function of Atzilus as it feeds and sustains Biyah. So he says there's two levels. We actually learned it earlier. I wrote here, look at page 1431, where I also, with more details about it. So he says like this, there's two levels when the spheres evolve from one another. Echad mitzad Atzilus HaAtzmiim. And Atzilus itself, Chachma leads to Bina, Bina leads to Das, Das leads to, they both lead to the Midos, Chesed to Gvura, to Tiferes, and so on. That's Atzilus HaAtzmiim. V'abeis mash Atzilus b'chinas mokel b'yah. And there's another function, how it's basically governing the lower worlds, b'yah. A simple example, a king. So there's a wisdom and there's emotions, how he runs his palace. It's an internal thing. It's not relevant to his subjects and to his empire, but there's an intelligence. He has a staff, an internal staff. And then there's the king, how he governs his empire, which also requires intelligence, laws, and rules, and so on. So essentially, the Midos, or essentially the Esses Spheres, which are the governing forces, basically the divine attributes, and same thing in the human being, our attributes, our faculties. So there's how they serve you, meaning you need Chesed, Gvura, you need all of them. There's also how they help you have a relationship with others. In this case, that's he calls Atzilus to Biyah. So just like in Atzilus you have these two levels, Kamoi Kain, B'chinas HaKeser is Beis Madregas. You could say that also in Keser you also have these two levels. V'hu Masha Keser Keilu Kala Esor Spheres Atzilus. HaRatzon is focusing and encompassing all the 10 spheres of Atzilus. It's not yet 10 spheres, conscious spheres, but Ratzon is already associating with them. And that's called a source for Atzilus. Like we said, Arich is the Nefesh and a source for Atzilus. The Seder Hamshacha B'zehu M'bchinas Chachma Bina Shebekeser. And the order, the progressive order here, is from Chachma and Bina, intelligence, and Keser, B'chinas Midos Shebekeser. That travels into Midos Shebekeser. So that's the first. And then there's the second level in Keser. Ub'chinas Etzem HaKeser, like Etzem Atzilus, for Keser itself. Shakol ub'chinas Ratzon Pashut. There, it's a Ratzon Pashut. It's a seamless and shapeless desire. It's not even taking on the beginning shape of what will come afterwards, which is Atzilus. V'yesh b'zeh gam kein esser spheres. There's also 10 spheres on this higher level. V'hain b'chinas HaRatzon liyas chachma, v'HaRatzon liyas bina, v'HaRatzon liyas midas. But there the focus is not on the actual faculties or attributes, it's on the desire to have them. God wants chachma. God wants bina. God wants midas. Somewhat similar that I've talked about to make it a little more palatable when we talked about the kavanas ha-mitzvahs. So when you do a mitzvah, you say mitzvah, you make a blessing. Asher kedeshanu b'mitzvah baruch atah Hashem l'keinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvah mitzvanu lahadlik ner Chanukah or lahadlik ner Shabbos Kodesh or tzitzis or tefillin and so on. So there's two parts to the blessing. One is an equalizer. Blessed are you, the King of the universe, that sanctified us and you commanded us. All the brachas have that same opening. The end is different. Here is to put on tefillin. Here's atifas talis, to wrap yourself in a talis. Here's to sit in a sukkah. Here's the dal minim. Here's achilas matzah. Same thing we see brachas hanenin. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol niyeh b'dvarei, b'yireh pri mezenos, b'yireh pri ha'etz, b'yireh mina mezenos, meitzi lechem min haaretz, etc. B'yireh pri adama. So the first part is focusing on God's will. He sanctifies with mitzvahs. The second part is in what aspect is it playing itself out. So in Avodas Hashem, Chassidus explains you need the kavanah klalis and the kavanah pratis. The kavanah klalis connects you directly with God Himself. Doesn't matter what He wants. That's why we say Le'olam ein adam shekel. A person, Pirkei Avos, he says a person shouldn't weigh and measure mitzvahs, which is a more chamura kala. They're all God's will. Whether it's a detail or it's a big mitzvah, even though there are differences, but your focus as a the commitment doesn't make a difference whether it's a small thing or a big thing. Then there's the other aspect, which is the actual mitzvah you have to focus on right now. You're being bavarer. You're refining one particular area in life, whether it's tzitzis or tefillin or it's Pesach matzah or sukkahs, a sukkah and dal minim, etc. And both are necessary. It's simply focusing on the kavanah klalis or the kavanah pratis. So taking it back here, same idea. This keser, as it's the ratzon, that's already associating to the midas that will become the midas of Atzilus and the spheres of Atzilus in structural form, Chachma bin, and then there's just the ratzon, the equalizer. So there are 10 spheres, but there's only one. It's the ratzon in each one of them. The ratzon within Chachma, the ratzon within Bina. And it's just two stages really in both in Avodah, in our bittul, and ultimately you need both. Because you want to bring the klolas, the kavanah, the ratzon into the details. But you want to make sure the details are informed by the powerful desire ratzon. Now we'll soon see how it comes back to Kudsha, Brich, Shechina, but this is essentially an explanation on yichud. The yichud of a higher level and a lower level. Okay. He tells us to look in Bir HaZeyar, al posik churi meresh omno ubagos al ze besider besefer tofresh tazvov. These are my morim from the Tzemach Tzedek. If somebody wants to look it up, I have the sources for it. I discussed it more at length when we learned it the first time. It's in Bir HaZeyar, volume 2, page 367, if you're interested. Well, the Fize Yashlemer, this is the conclusion of the parentheses. Ma'asha'aba v'ima malbishim l'zreyas the Arich Anpin. So in Kabbalah, there's an expression that Chachma and Bina, they are like garments for the arms of Arich Anpin. So Arich Anpin, think of it as the body itself, and then there's what's malbish, those zreyas, Abba v'ima. Harigama midas mislapshim ba'Abba v'ima, Tatzilis, loirak b'chinas malchus. Also, the midas manifest avim, not just malchus, so b'chinas nefesh canal, like we learned before that Arich is the nefesh for Atzilis. So it's not just avim malbishim the zureyas the Arich Anpin. In ezeu b'chinas hamidas shalpi b'chinas hachochma shebekeser. Okay, it's a little dense. I'll just say it briefly. Coming to say that these are the midas that are based on the lower level, the chochma shebekeser. So that's why they're connected to Abba v'ima and Arich Anpin. But then there's the higher level of Etzem HaKeser that's higher than all these levels. So just adding some explanation on this topic. 1 second, please. Okay. And it concludes now, the last line after the parentheses, the Midos HaAtzmiim, the Keser, he l'maylim b'chinas yislapshus b'Atzilus. So what do you see from this? That the Midos HaAtzmiim of Keser, the Midah is the lower level, you can say is not completely removed. But this level is removed. So we're setting the stage to understand Kudsha Brichu in Keser itself, which will be the next paragraph. We'll learn that in a moment. But that's what he's going to set up right now. So there's going to be Arich Malchus of Arich Anpin, which is like Shechina that manifests and relates to Atzilus. And there's the Midos HaAtzmiim of Keser that are beyond that Kudsha Brich. And the Yichud Kudsha Brich of Shechina is to bring these two seemingly the distant or disparate levels together in one Yichud. But let me stop if anybody who has any questions. Again, if there's questions on what we actually learned here, I'm probably going to refer you to what I taught the first time, because I'm not going to go into the details of this. I want to focus on the bigger picture, which is the yichud that Shema and Mitzvahs create, which is going to go another few pages. You're finally going to come back to concluding this on page 1441. So I'm moving very quickly to 1441. I don't mean to rush it, but I want to focus on the main theme here, not to get distracted. But still, anybody wants to ask anything, go ahead. Yeah.
This last part.
Go ahead.
Where he asked, where he said that Abba Chachma and Bina are still, that the Midos of Keser are still derivative of Chachma and Bina of Keser, or at least the Ratzon for Chachma and Bina, so that the Midos are still driven by Mochin, even though this is a Percha Mochin, I don't know, Stima or something. It's more than a palpable, or it's super.
There's two levels. He said there's two levels. There's the Midas that are driven by a hidden reason, and there's Midas that are not driven by any reason at all.
Okay, but this last part is driven by some reason, or no?
Which last part are you referring to?
Yeah.
About the Zroyes? This last piece, the last three lines? Hello? Yeah, I'd refer you to what I taught the first time, because it's going to get too complicated and dense. I was going to skip it, but I didn't want to skip a few lines since we're reading it all. But I would go there because it's a whole other discussion.
Can I ask one Chassidus supply question? I guess you can just say you can defer, but can I try to ask?
Go ahead.
This whole sugya that we've been going through, not just today, but the prior class, which I listened to, even though I wasn't in attendance, reminds me of how emotions percolate to a human being before, let's say, they even think about it, sort of like knee-jerk reaction, if you will. And then clinical psychologists and brain scientists say that the emotions, which is also manifested physically, medically through what they call the limbic system, is actually 3 times faster than the neural system. That some chemical reactions actually trigger emotions faster than the brain can even process them. And is that this notion that the Midos are rooted in Keser, so that they're actually, there's this almost a skipping over of Chachma and Bina Vatzilus, that what's driving the Midos is even higher than Chachma and Bina Vatzilus. Is that a compatible application of what's been taught here?
I'm not so familiar with the scientific and psychological parts, so it's
the
hard
notion
for
is
me
that you feel an emotion before you even think about feeling it. It's not, you don't have a chance to mediate it with your brain. Of course, that's what Chabad comes to do, is no, wait a second, we have to make sure our mochin are in control. But this sugya seems to be saying
But are we talking about like the id, like emotions that are about survival and about self-pleasure, about pleasure? Or are you talking about, like, give me an example of an emotion that would apply to?
Well, anger would be an example. Someone, upsets you and you get angry very quickly without even thinking about it. It's an example.
Well, I would think if anger is in the DNA and genes, probably yes. But if anger was a conditioning element from culture, because someone's father or mother used to get angry, it may not be rooted in Keser. It could just be rooted in your history and one's background.
Let's say, for example, just
that's why you have to, if you're talking about, for example, love and reverence of God, there the neshama is wired that way. It has that within it, except it's not revealed. You need to ignite it. So that's why I'm distinguishing it, depending what emotions we're talking about. Not all emotions necessarily are rooted in Keser, my point.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you. I hear you.
But there are some that are, and you probably can use this to explain that. The thing that it's interesting here, he's saying that even those are coming from a superconscious intelligence called Chachmas Tima that's driving those emotions. And then there's Midos HaAtzmiim. Midos HaAtzmiim is completely rooted. It's like your wiring. It's just like the color of your eyes. It's just simply, some people are chesed souls and some are gvura souls.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with any form of intelligence, just the way you're wired. I actually referred to a page earlier.
That was my next question. You read my mind.
Page 1428. One second. Page 1428. He spoke about Midos HaAtzmiim. Yeah, I remember that. Midos HaAtzmiim. Spoke about it by Lamaila, by Hashem. Like when Hashem has chesed, it has nothing to do with seichel. It's because he wants to have chesed. And he emanated an attribute called chesed. Then there's a level of chesed that's connected with intelligence. And then there's a level with conscious intelligence. But again, the point I want to make here is that I don't want to get too digress too much on this, because even though it's a fascinating topic, I want to focus on where he wants to go with this, which is really more to explain the two levels of Keser. That's what I'd like to continue. But any other questions?
I guess my only question is, if we're focusing here on, I mean, your focus running through this is the yichud of Shechina with Kudsha Brichu, and it seems like the moichin, the mind, would have to mediate that. Like if you want to have that unification.
Not necessarily. He's saying, not maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, we do know the contemplation in Shema is a mind thing. You contemplate on it. Is that the way we bring the Yichud Kudsha Brichu v'Shechina? It's very possible. And that, yeah.
And I'm just saying, if the Midos are Atzmiim, like you said, or if they're rooted in something superconscious, or I think you like to use the word superconscious rather than subconscious, very similar, then how does the mind mediate something that's subconscious?
Well, we don't know yet about the mediating. So when we get there, we'll talk about it. Right now, he doesn't say any mediating going on by the mind with Midos HaAtzmiim.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, actually says it's higher than Midos HaAtzmiim. So let's see where he goes with this.
That's why I'm asking.
Sometimes you have to get out.
Who says? But maybe we don't assume that. Maybe it's not mediating. Mind is not mediating here.
Like
100%.
We'll see. Let's see how he goes. I can't really answer.
Thank you very much
until I read on. Somebody else wants to say something?
I'm sorry, Rabbi. I was just commenting because I was thinking that, Mesiras Nefesh does not have to do with any logic. This was what we were learning, right? That it's beyond. It's not logical.
That's correct.
So we have to just accept that, I believe.
Look, I'd rather wait till he finishes the topic, because I'm not sure how far he wants to go with explaining this level of Midos HaAtzmiim. Now, I don't remember now when we learned it the first time. So let's see where he's going. He didn't finish this topic, so let's see how he concludes in the context of Kudsha Brichu and Shechina, and maybe this question may be answered. So let's see where he goes here.
Thank you.
So he says like this: V'yesh leimer, new paragraph, 1438. D'zeu gam ken b'chinas Kudsha Brichu v'Shechina. That here too we find these two levels. Remember, the key line is that Kudsha Brichu v'Shechina is Adrei Mamaylis, top of page 1436. And he's gone through from the bottom up. He went Malchus and Zah and Malchus, Chach Bina and Zah, Chachma Bina, Arich and Chachma. Now in Keser itself. So here's how he now ties it all together. He says, the B'chinas Malchus shebekeser, shebechinas Nefesh, like we learned on the previous page. Malchus of Keser, which is Malchus of Arich Anpin, which we learned is the Nefesh, Olam Shana Nefesh of Atzilus, the level of Ban, the Behemoth, where the Ruach, Yeredus Lamata, the Behemoth, whose energy flows downward. Shebekeser Sheyerid Mislabish B'Atzilus Canal, that descends and manifests in Atzilus, hu b'chinas Shechina. That relative to Keser itself, that's the level of Shechina. So now you see Shechina in a level that before we called it completely Kudsha Brichu, now it's being called Shechina because it's the lowest level in Keser. The Kamoi, Shezod Atzilus Nikra Malka Kadisha, just like we learned earlier, that Zov Atzilus was called Shechina, Malka Kadisha, the king. Canal. Kamoi Kain, I'm sorry. Wrong way of saying it. And the Bechinas Midos HaKeser, Shein L'mayla Mistapsha, so Zeh Bechinas Kudsha Brichu. I skipped a line. So Malchus of Keser is Shechina, which manifests in Atzilus and relates to Atzilus, and the Midos of Keser, that's higher than Islapshus and Atzilus, that's the level of Kudsha Brichu. The Kamosha Zod Atzilus, just like we spoke about the conscious Midos and Atzilus, Nikroi Malka Kadisha are called the king, the holy king, meaning Kudsha Brichu. Kamoi Kain Bechinas Midos HaKeser Bechinas Malka Kadisha Law. So too, so-called the Zoh of Keser, the Midos of Keser, is also that level, relative, of course, again. I prefer skipping the parentheses, to be honest, because it's going to just bog us down. I don't mean that in a negative way. Obviously, the Rebbe Rashab wrote it, so it's important. But it's going to be a little more Kabbalistic, and it's going to go back to the concept of the Zroyes. So I'll just sum it up briefly. He says, Yesh Lemer, he brings from Mishnah Chassidim, is a Kabbalistic work by Rabbi Yitzchak, by Emmanuel Chai Reiki, is a Sefer Mishnah Chassidim, where he writes the Kavanas. So he says, Chassidus brings it often. The Kavan of Avodim Ayinu, which is what we say in the Haggadah Pesach, when he says, V'yetziena Hashem Elokeinu, that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, of Egypt. So he says that the Kavana there has to be that Abba ve'ima Chachma Bina she'el bishu zreyas the Arich, like we just learned. They serve as garments to the arms of Arich, to the right and left arm of Arich. The L'cheira alei b'seder shtalshlus kachu the b'china zreyas the Arich mislapshin ba'avo. So he's asking, what do you need a special effort to do this? By Mitzrayim, that Yitzis Mitzrayim, that was the level. This is normal part of the process. That Abba ve'ima serve as garments to the arms of Arich. L'fi anal yeshlemer, he's saying, according to what we learned, we can say that the chiddush of Yitzis Mitzrayim is not just the regular flow from the Midos of Keser, from Arich Anpin into Abba ve'ima, but this is Slapshchin's Midos the Atzmi is the Keser. The Yitzis Mitzrayim is the Atzmius, the level that we took that's higher than structure. B'chinas Kudsha Brichu. Umezed dafka haGeula liyish zeh b'chinas bli gvul mamish. So the idea of the Midos of Arich that relate to the Chachmas Tima, there he says there's still a medida there. There's a measure, and that's the regular flow. Yitzis Mitzrayim reaches the higher level that we're talking about here, to bring from Kudsha Brichu, which is higher than any structural form, any intelligence, even superconscious intelligence. That's why he gave the power to transcend Mitzarim v'Gvulim, any form of boundaries and constraints, Gvul, because it's drawing from Kudsha Brichu. So essentially, he's saying the Yichud Kudsha Brichu, Shechina, and Keser that we're talking about, from the highest level that's completely removed to Malchus of Keser, that was one of the achievements of Yitzis Mitzrayim. It created that Yichud. That's why it could take us out even from the prison and the constraints and limitations of Mitzrayim. That's what he's adding here. Okay. But then going to go continue now. So that's one way to explain in Keser, Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina. But he said, but in truth, in the broader sense of the word, he says, b'chlolos. If you think in general terms, there's a simpler way to explain this whole process. In b'chinas Arich, hu b'chinas nefesh da'atzilus, canal. Arich is nefesh da'atzilus, and therefore, b'shem alukut Torah from the Arizal, hu b'chinas hashchina, hu b'chinas Shechina. So Arich is Shechina. The Atik, remember, Keser has another level called Atik. So why the Rebbe Rashab insisted on going into the details of the Moichin and Midos in Keser itself, I think it's because he wants to give us all the dynamics. But if you think in broader terms, he could have just said very simply, Arich is Shechina, and Atik, Shubchinis Tachteina Shebemaitzel, which is called not the Reishel and Etzolim, it's not the beginning of the emanations, it's called the lower level of the emanator, as we've learned a number of times. And it's higher than being a root of the emanations of Atzilus, in contrast to Arich. Nikra Kudsha Brichu, Shekodesh Shemuvdil. That's called Kudsha Brichu, that he's holy and sacred and removed. So that's in general terms. You can just say Kudsha Brichu Shechina. Because the truth is, the last 2 pages, literally, 2 complete pages almost, we focused on a whole understanding of Olam, Shana, Nefesh, Arich, Malchus, Midos, and then the Midos HaAtzmiim. So I have to think, maybe I spoke about it when I taught it the first time. Like, why do we need all that? He could have just said simply, Arich is relative to Atzilus. Arich compared to Chachma, yes, indeed, is Kudsha Brichu. And Chachma is the beginning of the Gilui, Reishis HaGilui. And then he can go further, and Arich, compared to higher than Atzilus, Arich is Shechina, and Atik is Kudsha Brichu. So I don't have a complete answer to why we needed this whole explanation. But again, my leaning is probably because it's giving us Asius words to be able to handle, to be able to apply it in our Avodah in more detail. The whole idea of the Midos and Moichin, but like we said, I'm not sure how we conclude and how we activate this process. He didn't really spell that out. We may have to figure that out ourselves. Or he may say something soon that will help us. So I'm not sure yet. So I'm still of developing it. Let's see where it goes here. So now he's going to speak about Atik and Arich. And as you see, I tell you what's interesting here. I know what he's saying. Okay. He's moving higher. He didn't mention Atik till now. In Arich itself, he said this Kudsha Brich and Shechinta. Yeah, I should have mentioned, now I realize. In Arich itself, Malchus of Arich is Shechina. Midos of Arich, especially Midos HaAtzmiim of Arich, that's higher than even the Tam Komos, even higher than the Chachmas Tema, that's Kudsha Brichu. So, Ach B'chlolos, he's now going higher. Saying Arich in general, even the Midos of Arich are Shechina, especially Malchus of Arich, of course, and Atik, which is even higher than Arich, is Kudsha Brichu. So he's really moving us further up to show us that we are uniting the highest levels, which actually is very interesting because if you heard any of the classes different people were giving on this Bosalagani that we learned, you're coming from Yud Shvat, chapter 15, and the Rebbe's Maimer, Tovshin Chofei and Tovshin Memhei, the Tzimtzumim before the Tzimtzum Arishan, etc., etc. Very much that's the theme. That L'mayla Aden Ketz, Ad Reima Milas. Very similar words. He doesn't use those words here, and he doesn't use Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta in the Maimer, Boslagani, but he's basically showing us, and the Rebbe says it very explicitly in his talks, that the whole point is to show us that we mesachit, that all these tzimtzumim are in order for us to unite with the higher level. Because what's the whole point of a tzimtzum between a teacher and a student? It's not to separate them, it's to connect them. The student and teacher are infinitely apart. So the behirus, like he uses the word, the brightness of the teacher's intelligence is just too bright for the student to be able to contain and receive easily. So there's a tzimtzum to tailor it and customize it to him. So the Rebbe says the expression he uses the Magid, which interestingly he quotes actually Ayin Beis in volume 2 when he started the whole topic back a long time ago in Ayin Beis volume 2. He brought the Magid Asel Chashtei Chatzetzres. Make for me 2 trumpets, and Chatzetzres is Chetzitzuris. You may recall us discussing, which means two half images. The half image is us, the human, the soul, and the other half image is the divine, like Maxis Hashekel. And the Eibishter made Kamet Tzimtzumim Derech Kama Elamis. That's the Magid of Mizrish's words. He made a number of Tzimtzumim through the worlds in order for us to be able to contain the light and then to climb and retrace the steps. Kedei Lisachid. The whole point is in order for us to Nisachid from the lowest levels all the way up. So Adrei Mamailis, Lamayla Mailad and Ketz, or here in the words here, Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta to the highest levels, is essentially these are the stepping stones. These are the steps that we're using as we climb. So first we would go from Biyah, or Malchus of Atzilus in Biyah, to Malchus of Atzilus in Atzilus, to Zah, which is the lower level of Kudsha Brich and Shechina, then from Zah to Bina, from Bina to Chachma, from Chachma to Keser, Ratzon, and in Ratzon itself, the levels we just learned, Malchus of Ratzon and the Midos of Ratzon, and now he's up to Atik. He's going to take us all the way to before the Tzimtzum. So very, very, now that I'm thinking about it, that the Rebbe brought actually this Magid, which is a big basis of Ayin Beis, especially starting from when he starts talking about Mamat Lamayla, Aramim Chelakaya Melech. Now we're talking about Mamayla Lamata through Torah, but he's also bringing Mamat Lamayla Shema and so on, that this unification, this interface, central theme of Ayin Beis, plays itself out here through our process of climbing Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta, Yichud Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta, from the lower level to the next level. So the Shechina gives us something to hold on to because it relates to us. Kudsha Brich is removed from us, but we want to connect to that. And then, as we connect to that, then we connect to a higher level of Kudsha Brich and Shechina. And so we climb all the way up to the highest Rema Milas. I think that helps a lot in understanding both what we're learning here and in general, good connection to Bas Legani. And it's interesting there, the ultimate answer, the ultimate is the Eitzer, the treasures that are hidden. Treasures that are hidden all the way to Etzem HaRatzon, all the way in the highest levels, are ultimately given to us down below to fight the battles that we have to fight, as I spoke about in the classes I gave on this theme. And that is also connected because if you remember, Etzem HaRatzon plays a tremendous role, especially v'yadaita yem v'shavesa levavecha ke'avayu elikim. Not just that avayu and elikim, that the tzimtzum is b'shvil ha'gilui. The tzimtzum is in order to bring gilui, and the gilui is in order to come through the tzimtzum. But einay, that the helam itself reflects the divine essence. So it all comes together here if you think about it. Yeah, interesting here. Okay, so now, if anybody wants to ask anything, I'll be happy to take questions. But the next section is going to explain Atik and Arich, how they are two opposites, and Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta is bringing them together. And then he's going to move even higher. I think he's going to move all the way to before the Tzimtzum, and you can imagine. If you remember, before the Tzimtzum, there's the energy where God's envisioning existence, Ola B'Ritzeinei, and Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, and then there's the divine beyond. So that, on a more subtle level, is going to be Kudsha Brich V'Shchinta as well. And I think I mentioned as well, Bas Legani, Tafshin Yud Aleph, the first Bas Legani the Rebbe said in 1951, the big focus in the beginning of the Maimer is there, what means Shechina? And based on this Ayin Beis and other Maimarim, what is Ikar Shechina B'Tachteinim? What level is Shechina? And he goes through all the levels, not every one literally like here, but very similar. So if you check out 1951, Bas Legani, Tafshin Yud Aleph, it also comes together. Okay. Any questions? So now he says like this, Va'inyan, 3 lines from the bottom of 1438. The Inyan now to explain Atik and Arich. I actually made a mark for myself that the words Ach B'chlolos, after the parentheses I made, it should be a new paragraph. Which makes sense because now he's moving to Atik and Arich, another level. So it says, the inyan in this is as follows. The Atik Yomin v'Arich Anpin. So Atik Yomin literally means the one of ancient years. Atik has many meanings, as we'll learn, but literally it's a pasuk in Daniel, where Daniel says a vision that he has. It says, "V'Atik Yomin Yosef al Kursaya." So literally it means the one of ancient years, like a sage, is sitting al Kursaya on a throne. V'Sar Reishe Ka'omer Naka, and the head on his hair. I'm sorry, the hair on his head. The hair on his head is Ka'omer, is like semer, was white like wool. V'Lufusha Kitlak Chiver, and his garments are white like snow. Flag is snow, shelig. So obviously it's a very cryptic verse, but that's the basis of Atik Yomin, referring to a level that's very removed. That's why Atik means ancient, but also means removed, netak. Arich Anpin literally means the long face. Arich is long in Aramaic, and like Arich. Anpin is ponim, like a Arich ponim, when you say Arich apayim, Arich ponim. So Arich Anpin in Aramaic is a face. Zoyer Anpin, when we say Zoh, Zoyer is the opposite of Arich, it's a small face. So the Midos of Atzilus, conscious Midos, are called the small face. You can call it the small structure, the small visage. And Arich Anpin is called the long face, means the large structure. Like we learned, the Midos of Zoh are rooted in the Midos of Arich. So he's going to explain now how these two levels are, on one hand, very distant from each other, and that's why you compare them to Shechina and Kudsha Brich. So he says like this. Atik Yomin v'Arich Anpin harizeh shemes murkavim mishnei inyanim hafchim. Both of these names are composites of two opposite features. The Atik hu inyan ha'toke v'avdola. See, here he's interpreting Atik means removed. When you say something is removed from something, ha'toke. Like you remove something, you call it your my ticket. Sometimes even copying something, when you copy something, your my ticket, you're copying it from one place to another. But it's in a state of removal. The Yomin, and the second half, Yomin means days. Hu b'chinas hamshacha v'gilui. Like we say, Vayikra Elikim Yom. Yom is a gilui. Atik is removed. So seemingly like two different opposite features. Same thing with Arich Anpin. Arich Anpin, Arich is bligvul. When you say Arich, you mean long. So you're referring to something that has no limit, ultimately. But Anpin, next page, 1439, hu b'chinas hagbala. Anpin means a face. A face is a structure. The ponim hu b'chinas hamechin, shem b'chinas hagbala. Ponim refers to the level of meichin, of intellect, that's inside the face, meaning carry the brain inside the face. In general, it's an pnimi, that's why it's called ponim. Face is pnimi. Not an makif, pnimi, meaning a structured, internal, immanent energy, which seems to be different than arich, which refers to something that's bligvul. So both arich and both atik and arich both seem to be terms that contain opposite features. Acha inyanhu. Here's the explanation. Now I think after learning all these years, we know that it's all about interfaces. So it makes total sense, because both of them serve as an interface. Keser in general is an interface, but Atik and Arich are specifically each one. So he says, the Arich Anpin nimshecha Arich la Anpin. That's what Arich Anpin's function is to draw down the bligvul of Arich into Anpin, into the structural face. V'hainu arichis haponim. So it doesn't say just Arich and Anpin, it says the ponim itself should become an arichis. Like if you remember, we learned about how time itself becomes higher than time. When you do a mitzvah, you can take a moment, a fleeting moment, and make it eternal. Because what you did in that moment now is forever. Like he says in Tanya. So the point is to make an arichis in the ponim, to bring bligvul into gvul, essentially. V'hainu, shezeu b'chinas ha'er ha'shayich el ha'pnimius. So Arich Anpin is already the Oyer. It's not the Primius of Atzilus, but it's already preparing the ground for that, like we learned. Arich Anpin is the Reish or Sheresh HaNetzolim. So it's already Shaykhis to Primius. Actually, B'chinas Arichas HaPonim She'ena B'chinas Hagbala. So it's relating to Ponim, to a face, but it's still in the state of Arichas. It's still in a state, a long state, meaning, so it relates to a face, but it's in a state that is not yet defined, not yet completely confined. Same thing with Atik Yomin on a higher level. But Atik Yomin nimshach tevis Yomin al Atik. When you say Atik Yomin, you're saying that the Yomin are following and an extension of the word Atik. The Hainu shenetak mebchinis Yomin. That means it's netak, it's removed from Yomin. But at the same time, it's Atik Yomin. It's the Atik, the remove from those days. V'yadua, what is the level? He says now, the Atik Yomin, Ze'abchina Zayin Tachtein is the Atik. When you say Atik Yomin, you're talking about the 7 lower levels of Atik. That's why there's days, because there's 7 days. So 7 levels. And the point is, like with Arich, but of course this is a higher level, that the 7 days, or the 7 lower levels of Atik, not just the higher level, should also be in a state of Ataka, of transcendent state. So essentially you're taking something that has some structure, Yomin, the 7 lower levels, and you're elevating it to a state of transcendence, removed from the structure. Now, I don't know how much he's going to explain, but the understanding of this is essentially the whole theme of Ayin Beis, interface. Wherever possible, you want to bring 2 levels together. So you bring something that's on our terms, which is more connected to Gvul, like Ponim or Yomin, and then you infuse it with something that's higher, that represents more of a godlier transcendent state, Arich, or higher, Atik. That's essentially what he's saying here, in brief. And I feel because Ayin Beis is so much around Keser, could be that Rebbe Rashab felt the importance to emphasize that in Keser itself is Atik and Arich are the Mamutza. Atik is a higher level, Arich is a lower. That in Atik and Arich itself, you have both the interface itself in each one of them. As we've discussed, the interfaces never can have enough, because it's like steps. You don't want to skip a step. If you want to climb to a very high level, you want every step covered. So you want a step that this step then reaches to the next step, and that reaches you to the next step. So you always have something lower and something higher to hold on to as you climb. That's in more Baal Batish words, what we're learning here. So let me just finish the Atik and Arich, and then I'll take questions. As I said, from Meir Papirash, a great Kabbalist, it's like an encyclopedic, Kabbalistic encyclopedia. So he says, in Mareches Ayin, it's structured around letters. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, letter Ayin, Os, Nun, Hey, letter 15, letter 25, 55 rather. Atik Nikra Vav Tachtenis. That Atik is called the 6 lower ones, not 7, 6. But Arich Anpin Hamal B'Shei say, and Arich Anpin, which gives it like a garment. So Atik encloses it, Nikra B'Shem, Gamkein Al Shem Shmoi Atik Yomin, Atkan L'Shene. So there's a level of Arich that's also called on the name Atik Yomin, because it's essentially giving it a garment. He's just adding that, I believe, just for thoroughness, to show us these, again, 2 levels here. Why he says Vov Tachtenis and not Zayin is interesting. And he doesn't even qualify, he doesn't explain. I'd have to look that up. Because he just said Zayin Tachtenis, that's Zayin Yomin. Now it's Vov Tachtenis. Maybe because the lowest one, Malchus, is already Arich. Not sure. Okay. The Ayin Mashin is Bar Le'il tells us, refers us to what we learned earlier, Dibra Masli El Masei. That's back in, they say below Brach's Bar, volume 2. Be'inyan Meir Shana. So they spoke about 100 years of Sarah, Chai Sarah, by Meir Shana, that 100. The Atik came and Islapsus Atik Ba'arich, Ba'arich Amp Mishana Loshen Yachim Mipnei Antu Chad. So there we learned that Meya Shana, Meya is 10 times 10. If I recall correctly, that's Arich, because it encompasses all the 10 spheres. In the Meya Shana, the Atik Yomin. No, I'm sorry. It's not Atik Yomin. The Al Yedei Slapshus Atik Ba'arich. Let me correct myself. That through Atik manifesting within Arich, it causes Arich Anpin to be, it says Meya Shana, not Meya Shanim. It causes the 100 all to become Lashon Yachid, Mepnei the Antu Chad. So you see the Yichud here, because you are one and not of any number. So basically, Meya Shana, he explains there, even though Meya is Arich, but it's the Hamshach of Atik and Arich, so it's Shana Lashon Yachid. It's the Hamshach of Achdus of Atik into the multiplicity of the 100 of Arich. That's what he said there. Okay, so we have now that Atik and Arich are Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina. And I was going to go even higher. I'm going to go to Ak, Adam Kadmon. But I think I'll stop here because this goes now to the next level. Remember, Atik and Arich are still Keser of Atzilus. Higher than that is Nekudim, Akudim, and ultimately Ak. So the next stop is Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina in the world of Adam Kadmon, the first world after the Tzimtzum and the Kav. So I'm going to stop here, but let's see if there are any questions. Anybody wants to ask anything? Yeah, it's going to talk about Ak. Just bear in mind, the most important thing to keep in mind is that he's essentially giving us a blueprint of how to climb the ladder, how to retrace our steps from our existence higher and higher. And he's calling it the Yichud of Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina, which is achieved through mitzvahs, and as we're going to learn, through Shema, which we'll get back to in a few pages. Page 1441 is where he goes back and says, now we'll understand what mitzvahs accomplish and what Shema accomplishes. So we'll get back to that. And that's what I'm driving at. But meanwhile, he's given us a whole bunch of series of steps. Spell out again, Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina, Zah and Malchus of Atzilus, Binan and Zah, Chachma, Bina, Arich and Chachma, the Malchus of Arich and the Midos of Arich, Atzmiim, Midos HaAtzmiim of Arich, and now Atik and Arich. That's so far the Kudsha, Brich, and Shechina that he's laid out here. And there's going to be a few more, as I said, all the way going back all the way to the engine room, to the root itself. Okay, I'm going to stop here, but I'll take questions.
I don't want to dominate the question asking. Does anyone else want to go ahead of me? Okay, so I'll ask. Forgive me, but this is
At least you gave them a chance.
Yeah, this is basic Hasidus, and please forgive me, but I think it's since we're here at these higher levels trying to understand the connection with Kudsha, Brich, I personally need a little tiny refresher. I don't understand how Atik is somehow lower than Ak, but yet the Tachton Shebemaitzel, because as I understand it, after if it's below Ak, it's Atik is then part of a post-Tzimtzum reality. But when we said that's the Tachton of the Maitzel, then we're saying it's part of a pre-Tzimtzum reality. So I get confused whether Atik is pre-Tzimtzum or post-Tzimtzum.
Okay. So you remember that everything is microcosm, macrocosm. So there is, we don't call it Atik usually, but in the macrocosm, you do have a similar level like Atik of Atzilus, what's called the Atik of Resha de Golgalta of Ak, above Ak, which is rooted before the Tzimtzum. But in microcosm, then Atzilus, the microcosm, so then Atik and Arich are Keser of Atzilus, and then they're lower than Ak. So it all comes down to
where? Yeah.
Similar levels, but it's microcosm, macrocosm. If you recall, Atzilus, the Klolos, would then be Malchus and the Esser spheres, Hagnuzas, the 10 hidden spheres, right before the Tzimtzum. And then Bria the Klolos is Ak, and Yetzirah the Klolos is akudim, nekudim, or Atik and Arich.
I see.
And Asiya the Klolos would be Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiya the Protis, a microcosm. So if you talk in microcosm, that's what we're talking here. In macrocosm, you could associate. Now remember, when you say Netzolim, Atzilus is called Netzolim. Atzilus is lower than Ach. So Reishel Netzolim or Tachtena Shebamaitzel, you're talking relative to Atzilus, is Tachtena Shebamaitzel. So it really encompasses everything higher than Atzilus, representing the divine that is the Tachtena of the Maitzil. The Maitzil itself is not the highest level. The Maitzil means the source that emanates. Like when we said in the Pasuk, Hashem took Ve'atzalti min haruach asher alecha, that I imparted from the Spirit upon you, Moshe, into the Skenim. So there the Maitzil is Hashem, but he's taken from Moshe and imparting it to the Skenim. So you're talking about a level. The question is microcosm or macrocosm. Microcosm would be Keser of Atzilus and Atik and Arich. And macrocosm would be the levels right before the Tzimtzum, where Arich often is Ak, as we're going to learn soon, and Atik is that which is above Ak. But that's in macrocosm. Does that help?
Yes, 10,000%.
So keep in mind that you're going to have these ideas repeat themselves. Like often you'll say, whatever we learn about Atzilus and microcosm, we can apply to Atzilus and macrocosm. But with a big qualification, it's a completely different level. Like just like you would say, there's Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya in Asiya itself. So someone will say to you, what do you mean? Atzilus is higher than Bria. So what do you mean there's Atzilus and Asiya? See what I'm saying?
Yes.
Or you say that in Malchus you have Chachma, Bina, Das, but Chachma is higher than Bina. Because you're talking in Malchus, you have the 10 spheres. So everything is always encompassing everything else. And then sometimes the expression is that the Malchus of Chachma becomes the Chachma of Malchus. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So no. So it's a constant, being that it's not, as I said, it's not a cupboard with linear time and space. It's essentially archetypes and concepts and levels. So you have to think of it in those conceptual terms, which is abstract. It is not as easy to wrap your head around because we're not talking about, physical items that you say, okay, here is Mercury, Venus, Mars, Earth, or Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc.
So the only way to know whether they're speaking in a macrocosm sense or micro is the context of the sugya.
Yeah, generally the default is microcosm. Macrocosm, usually the mimer will spell that out. It will say Atzilus de Klolos, or sometimes you have to figure it out yourself, but often, generally speaking, when we talk about, because remember, it's all about empowering us. To talk about Atzilus de Klolos before the Tzimtzum is far harder than to talk about Atzilus that we usually talk about, which is the beginning before Bria. Even though, as I say, the Alter Rebbe would tremble even when he said Atzilus in microcosm, but still, in a way, it's more relatable because it's an actual structure. Before the Tzimtzum, it all is purely conceptual, meaning it's only potential, it's God envisioning it, it's on God's terms, things I've talked about many, many times. Look, the key thing to really, just to be able to be somewhat at peace with all of this, is to remember that you just have to find a way to understand it where you are right now. You don't need to figure every level out. It's going to be very difficult to do that. Because then you're going to have to, if someone asks you, can you tell me the difference in Avodah between Etzem HaRatzon and Ispashtus and Lifnei Tzimtzum, and then Ak and Akudim, and then Keser and Atzilus, in your avodah, you say, you know what? I'm just trying to be a good person, trying to think about God a little. So that's why it's good to know academically these levels all exist. But the real place you appreciate is when you can find personal application. Like I always say, to find somewhere, like I spoke before, so kavana pratis, kavana klolis. You have to find somewhere handles that translate into your personal life. So this applied. Then it becomes easier to talk about. And then you can say, and now that I got that, so if I go a little beyond myself, I'm entering into the next so-called domain, the next higher level, Kudsha, Brich, Shechina. So it's like studying. Today you understand something, and some things are over your head. Then you go a little further, a few days pass, and then you start getting that too. I'm sure all of us here could map out a trajectory where you were 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, a year ago, and where you are now. And you'll see clearly things that were completely cryptic and you never think you get. Today you understand it better. Not saying perfectly, but no one understands it perfectly.
Thank you.
I just myself had a few epiphanies over Shabbos in Ayin Beis, though I'd learned it I don't know how many times. But I started reading a few things, and as I'm writing this essay, I'm going over things again, and I keep discovering new gems and new things that I remember reading, but I didn't understand the full context. So this is the journey. That's what makes it so exciting.
Yes.
I never feel I'm going to be, even though I think I have a good handle on it, but I never like to think I'm going to master it. I want it to master me, to be honest.
It's beautiful. Thank you. That was extremely helpful.
And it's really, this is what a godly experience is. It's not about me, and me trying, obviously you want to understand on your terms in a way you can relate to it. That goes without saying. But ultimately, what you really want is to be absorbed in a higher experience. And that's where it really requires to so-called strip yourself sometimes, and what I always say, to suspend your previous kalim, to be able to absorb something higher.
Absorb, yeah. Loud and clear.
It's not just to remember, it also allows you to travel there.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
A wet sponge can't go very far. A dry sponge.
Yeah, dry sponge is lighter than a wet sponge. I hear you.
Yeah, and a dry sponge, however, will absorb beautifully. Like when you see someone very hungry, it absorbs very well. And so it's like clay reikon. You have to empty your kalim to allow more into you. And this is really the journey. That's what it comes down to. I remember when I was a far, far younger man, and I began learning Chassidus when I was, 19, maybe 18, 19. I get into Shari Yichud. I discovered Shari Yichud from the Mittler Rebbe. Shari Yichud is actually like a roadmap. It's like a blueprint. Where the Mittler Rebbe actually says, I'm going to lay out the whole Shtalshlus from the Tzimtzum, from before the Tzimtzum and the Kav, all the way to Asiyah. It's his words. So you can imagine how exciting it is. You're finally going to get a whole map, And the Rebbe is going to lay it out. I don't have to do it myself. And I remember I was so excited. I remember like today, and I started reading. I couldn't put it down. And the first few chapters, pretty good. He lays it out quite clearly. It's deep stuff, but it's not like it was with handling. Like you really felt that there was a map of Ishtalshlus. Then at some point, maybe 5, 6 chapters in, it started getting a little more confusing. And I realized it's not so simple.
Yeah, I can relate.
Not just the understanding of it. I realized, yes, it's exciting to be able to have the map. And I did learn the map there. To be honest, I can lay out. A lot of people, you ask them where's the level, they don't know where it belongs. Where's Atik? Where's Arich, like you asked, or other levels? But then I realized that is good to know because you have the lay of the land. But the real work is understanding it personally. Like where is it in you? Not where is it in the cosmos.
Cosmic scheme.
Yeah, and that was a very, very. I remember when I came to that realization, and I realized so again, no problem creating a map and a picture and an image, and qualifying that. Obviously, it's not a physical map, but then you start realizing it's all conceptual, beautiful levels of how you grow. It's a way of measuring where you're at in life. Is your chesed an asiyadika chesed, a survival-based chesed? Is your chesed a shaped chesed, yitziradika chesed, which has a little more spirit in it? Is it your chesed more of a raw structure like bria, or is it natzilus, a visionary chesed? They become real language of knowing how to look at yourself in different dimensions, so to speak.
It's beautiful, amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it's very dynamic. And I also just,
I would say relative, not dynamic. It is dynamic, but it's more relative.
And the most
well,
exciting part of it is it's really an X-ray of you. That's what it comes down to. It's an
Yeah.
X-ray
mhm.
of your DNA, your spiritual DNA.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I asked about the limbic system. I actually sent you something about that privately, to help me understand myself a little better. But I'm digressing here.
No, the parallels with psychology and with physics are absolutely astounding. There's so many parallels. I mean, one of my big dreams is I wish we could inspire some physicists or psychologists to come up with tremendous insights in their work based on Ayin Beis or Chassidus in general. That would be unbelievable.
Yeah, sorry, Robin, I interrupted you. I apologize.
It's okay. Um, I just was going to make one other comment. I just thought it was interesting when you talk about interface and we're talking about Arich Anpin, like the whole thing is about interface. It's literal, I guess, but it just struck me
Oh,
that,
interface. Good. That's
That's
nice.
very
Yeah,
good,
face.
Robin. That's lovely.
yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Interface. And remember, I always say panim in Hebrew is interesting because in Hebrew, panim means a face, but also pnimius, inside.
Internal.
In English, when you say on the face of it, you mean only the surface. It's an interesting thought. So the panim is like the inside reflects the outside the inside. The inner beauty is expressed in the outer face, and the outer face is reflecting the inner. And in English, when you say the face, you say on the face of it, the surface, ostensibly it looks like that, but what's going on underneath?
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that panim is very seamless. What's in the Gemara, it's called teiche kibare, which means his inside is like his outside. Not like where they say someone says one thing, white man speaks with forked tongue. You say one thing, you mean another.
No, it's really beautiful. All is
No,
just
it's a difference between duplicity and
right. No,
seamlessness and oneness.
absolutely, but it has both aspects to it. Like again, what you're talking about.
Well, that's what
It's
he said. Yeah,
healthy.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It
So
So
gives
we're
new
able
meaning.
to,
Yeah.
yeah.
It gives new meaning to the phrase, as long as we're doing puns, to the term two-faced.
Yeah, absolutely. And pun
This
is
is
also from the word punim, no? Pun?
yeah.
right.
This is
You're
this is
kidding.
this is a more Haliga two-faced.
No, but there's some two-phase that are quite not that helic.
Exactly.
It's called
I,
echad bepeh, echad belev. One thing you say with your mouth, and another thing going on in your heart. It's called a backstabber.
yeah, exactly. I have a question about this year's Basti Lagani, but it's probably something for off recording.
So let me stop the recording right now, and we can do that. And I've got to go do things. So where are we? We're middle of page 1439. Stop by Atik and Arich, 1439. We're going to move to Ak. Okay, let me stop.